So increasingly, entire neighborhoods would come together and enter into private contracts saying that they would never ever sell their houses to black people. That way, all the neighbors who signed on to the contract then had the right to sue if any other neighbor turned around and sold their home to a black person. And they would create the contracts to run with the land, as they say in the biz, meaning that it was binding to the property and to subsequent owners of the property, meaning these racially restrictive agreements were then taken on by subsequent buyers of the same property. This is also the reason why homeowners associations were created, to restrict blacks from entire subdivisions. So there's a fun fact to bring up at your racist Great Aunts barbecue next week. And this practice was pervasive in virtually every major city and suburb in the United States for the first half of the 20th century. And these restrictive covenants were upheld again and again by courts across the country as perfectly constitutional because they were private agreements between private parties, not state action against a certain race. And despite the fact that it was acknowledged that government-sanctioned and enforced housing restrictions would be unconstitutional, the government continued to restrict access to housing for Black Americans, especially via the FHA. The Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934 in response to the Great Depression to allow the U.S. government to help fund the purchase of housing, thus creating desperately needed construction jobs and helping people who had been flattened by the Depression get back on their feet and purchase property. The way the FHA worked is by using government funds to ensure private bank mortgages that covered 80% of purchase prices and had terms of 20 years. Because the FHA is the one insuring the mortgage on the house, the FHA then insisted on doing its own appraisal of the property to make sure that the loan had a low risk of default. That's what insurers do. They see whether the risk is high or low, and they prefer to insure lower risk things because then they get to keep their money. And what was in the handbooks and manuals for all FHA insurance appraisal agents? A whites-only restriction. Basically, the FHA, as well as other mortgage insurers, had determined that black homebuyers were too risky.